following is a CUNY TV special presentation.
Good morning, everybody. And I want to thank you for joining us this morning. Today we have a panel pulled together to have a frank discussion about the future of employment and economic development in New York City. So a couple of facts about our city. If New York were its own country, we would have the 11th largest economy in the entire world between Canada and South Korea. We are on pace to have a higher GDP than any other city in the world in about 15 years, surpassing Tokyo, which is now #1. We are home to the world's first and second largest stock exchange, and domestically, when it comes to corporate headquarters, we have no peers. The second closest city is Houston, and we are roughly double the number of Fortune 500 companies having their global headquarters here. So we also have access to the best entertainment, culture, talent in every sector you can imagine, and unparalleled diversity. So as New Yorkers, we've gotten used to being special. But I think recently we all know we've suffered some dings. SALT has been a big ding to us in terms of higher taxes and really us continuing to contribute more to being more of a donor state to DC than when we get back. The stalling and the debate of Gateway poses a material infrastructure challenge for us. And then, of course, Amazon, which reversed its decision to bring 25,000 new tech jobs to Queens. So while there's little doubt we are the greatest city in the world, we definitely have real competition from other cities and other regions, and we can't take anything for granted. We're really excited to have our panelists today here to talk about the future of jobs, how we continue to maintain our place as the most successful and innovative city for companies, how we do right, how those companies are good neighbors and do right by our citizens, and how we can have as much opportunity for everybody. So it's my pleasure to welcome them. We have Jonathan Boles, the Executive Director of the Center for an Urban Future, Purnima Kapoor, Planning Consultant and Adjunct Faculty, Columbia University, and the former Executive Director of the Department of City Planning, Gail Mello, the President of LaGuardia Community College, Seth Pinsky, EVP of RXR Realty and the former head of New York City's EDC, and Councilmember Richie Torres, Chair of the Council's Committee on Public Housing. You can learn a lot more about each of them on the materials on your chair. So I want to say thank you all for being here. Thank you for your commitment to our city. I also want to take a moment to thank the Educational Alliance and its president and CEO, Alan Van Capel, who is a proud ABNY board member, for hosting us this morning. And now, to start us off on the discussion, I want to pass the mic to Jonathan Boles.
Thanks so much. And thanks to ABNY and all of you for being here today and for inviting me here. I'm Jonathan Boles. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for an Urban Future. We're a research policy organization focused on New York City's economy and on expanding economic opportunity. And so ABNY asked me to just spend a few minutes going through, trying to set the frame for today's discussion. And so, I'm a data geek, and so I have some data for you. So first of all, when we're talking about what's next for economic development in New York City, or where are the jobs, I think it's really important to start from where we are right now. And I think, as Stephen mentioned, we're in a pretty remarkable place. It's just kind of stunning to see what we've done just over the last 10 years. And this is the most recent economic data right now. From April 2009 to April 2019, New York City had a net gain of 903,000 jobs. These are private sector jobs, taking us to more than 4 million jobs citywide. This 10-year gain is more than all but 4 states. This is the highest total of jobs New York City has ever had by a long shot, it's a lot more than any previous economic expansion. On top of all that, this is a chart going back to the 70s, looking at the unemployment rate. If you look here, we started at a pretty high level in the 70s. We got up to a high level lots of times over the years. But if you see on the far right there, that's the kind of more recent years, we're at the lowest unemployment rate basically in the city's modern history. And it continues to go down at about 3.7% in April of this year. So I'm done. We're done here in New York City. The economy is doing great. No more work to do. Actually, that's not the case. And I think that this conversation is so important because we still have a lot of work to do. And I'm going to go into a couple of the reasons why and what the issues are. One is that we absolutely need a lot more good-paying, accessible jobs in New York City. The economy has been doing so well. Job creation in itself is very important. There's lots more people that are working. But if you look here, the blue is the previous expansion, that 36% of the jobs that were created, according to a recent study by the state comptroller, paid above the average wage in jobs. In this expansion, it's only 23%. We did an analysis over the last 10 years of the industries that have been adding the most jobs, and as you can see here, these are 7 sectors that together accounted for more than half of all the 900,000+ jobs that were created in New York City. All of these are lower than average economic sectors. We like that they're adding jobs. It's important for the city's economy. But as you can see here, the home health care sector, whose jobs are not that well paying, added 130,000 by itself. Restaurants and bars by itself added about 115,000 jobs. Again, this is important. It's putting a lot of folks to work. But we need to also be thinking about more better paying, accessible jobs. At the same time, some of the traditional, the kind of old standby sectors of the city's economy have been producing slower growth in recent years. Some of them are not growing at all. So you can see here, it's important that finance added nearly 9,000 jobs over the last decade, but at a time when the city overall was adding 900,000, that's a fairly small share, and we know that finance companies are moving middle-class jobs to Utah, to Florida, to Texas, to other places. Hospitals, these are, in the healthcare sector, some of the better-paying, accessible middle-class jobs. Home health care added about 130,000 jobs. Hospitals added about 8,900. In fact, there were more jobs created during this 10-year period at daycare centers, which are fairly low-paying, than in hospitals in New York City. Legal services, for a long time, not necessarily recently, for a long time, legal services was another high-wage part of the economy that was so important and growing quite often. In the last decade, actually a net loss of 100 positions in legal services. Manufacturing, which had long been such a great platform into the middle class, accessible jobs. But when I looked at the 74 different industries on the state labor department for New York City over the past decade, manufacturing was dead last in terms of job creation, losing 13,500 jobs over the past decade. There is good news here. We are producing a lot of high-end jobs in New York City. The tech sector has become so critical. It's helped diversify the city's economy. It has become a major new engine of job growth. There's a lot of ways of looking at and trying to understand how big the tech sector is. It's difficult because a lot of tech jobs are embedded into other industries. But at a very conservative way of doing this, we find that just in the last 10 years, the tech sector has added about 63,000 jobs. I think certainly it's a lot more than that, but that has become a major and important source of high-wage jobs in New York City. Management, scientific, technical consulting services, also very technology-oriented, adding about 24,000 jobs. The creative industries also. I put advertising and architecture on here, but also film, design, lots of other parts of the creative economy. It's such a competitive advantage for New York, and those jobs have been growing quite a bit in recent years. I think the challenge is that so many of these high-wage jobs today, I think folks from lower income backgrounds have been struggling to get them. We've seen that there's a lot of economic frustration out there. There's a lot of working New Yorkers that feel like they are not getting ahead. And one of the reasons is that we're in an economy today that's a more complicated economy. so many of the good jobs, the high-wage jobs that are being created, require some sort of college credential or a higher-end like certificate or apprenticeship type program to get on the path to those jobs. And as you can see here, only about 14.9%. This is a Brookings analysis recently of all the major metros in the nation of all the jobs, how many of them are good jobs or promising jobs that don't require a bachelor's. In New York City, it's just 14.9%. So we see in this economy how much more important having some sort of college credential has become. I'm hoping Gail can talk about this a little more. I'm sure she will. But you can see here that nationally it's 21%. In New York City, it's only 14.9%. We also, my colleagues and I, have been working on an analysis of the Labor Department projections for the next 10 years. We looked at the fastest growing occupations in New York City, and then we kind of crossed off anything that paid less than $50,000 on average. So when you just look at the occupations that are growing the fastest and that pay at least $50,000 a year on average, you see that 9 of those occupations typically go to folks with at least a bachelor's, and 1 of those 10 occupations typically go to folks with an associate's degree or higher. So again, the premium on education in this economy is really increasingly important. And we've got an issue here. And this is a speech and a conversation about economic development, but I think these days economic development more than ever is really tied to education. It's tied to apprenticeships, workforce development. And you can see here, this is one of the reasons why, while a college credential has become so much more important to good paying jobs, accessing good paying jobs, you can see here that while Manhattan, about 61% of the residents have at least a bachelor's, it's more like 30% in Brooklyn, Staten Island, and Queens, and 19% in the Bronx. So if that's the situation, it certainly says we have to be investing more in education, workforce development, apprenticeships, certificates, other programs, but we also need to see if we can figure out how do we get more good-paying, accessible jobs. So there's one more big issue and another reason why we should still care and still be focusing on economic development in this city, and that is the kind of coming wave of automation. Already a lot of folks that are working have really faced challenges getting into good paying jobs, but then we've got this new trend to deal with, New York City is probably only at risk of losing around 7,000 jobs to automation altogether, according to our analysis. But there's about 450,000 positions across New York City that are highly vulnerable, where about 80% of the tasks in those occupations are at risk of automation. And many of those positions are low-skill, entry-level positions. And so if it's already difficult enough for people from lower-income backgrounds to get into high-wage jobs, now we're going to have to contend with the possibility that some of the lower-wage, entry-level positions that are more accessible could also be disrupted and in many cases see significant job losses or fewer job gains in the years ahead. This is the automation potential of all of these fields here. Sewing machine operators, they've already suffered a lot of losses, but also mail clerks, food prep workers, cooks, laundry workers, dishwashers. I think anybody that's gone into a McDonald's recently know that you no longer go up and order from a person, you order from a kiosk. You walk into a lot of retail establishments and you do self-checkout. We're losing a lot of entry-level positions for people without high levels of education attainment. This is something we're going to have to contend with. So what do we do about it? I'm really hoping the panel can help us figure this out. Just a few quick thoughts from me. I think absolutely tech has become increasingly important, not just as a source of high-wage jobs, but I think we ought to start looking at it as a new middle-class job of the future. That doesn't mean we're there yet. I think we've got to make it a new middle-class job of the future. We've got to be investing in those pipeline programs from the earliest ages on up into adulthood and adult workforce development programs, but especially also CUNY. I think the creative industries, they're growing, but they also suffer from a lack of diversity, and I think we could do a lot better to get more people from lower income backgrounds into creative occupations. We've done a little bit of research, partnering with ABNY actually, on the tourism economy. As New York City tourists have gone from 30 million a year to 65 million a year over the last 20 years, we've seen incredible job growth in the tourism and hospitality sector. And not all of them are great paying jobs, but there's a lot of them that are, and this is something that is growing in the city's economy. There are now more than 50,000 jobs at hotels, and the average hotel job in the city pays actually more than a manufacturing job today. We ought to be looking at hospitality and tourism as one part of middle-class jobs of the future. Education and education services has been a growth area. Infrastructure, by this, I believe that investing in infrastructure can create middle-class accessible jobs. I don't think we've done enough of that in New York City and New York State. We can do more. Warehousing, this one is still playing out, but just over the last 3 years, New York City has seen a 58% increase in warehousing jobs. I mean, I think as we're seeing people ordering online from Amazon and other places, there's a need for some of the logistics for the just-in-time delivery. They're not necessarily that job intensive, but again, in the last 3 years, 58% increase in jobs in New York City. The jobs pay about $41,000 a year on average in New York City. Lastly, we've written a lot about just the opportunity to scale up more of our small businesses and startups. We all know how important it's been for New York City to get this startup ecosystem. It's really been such a strength of New York City's economy. I think in the years ahead, we have an opportunity to create more good-paying jobs if we can turn more of these startups and small businesses that have 5 or 10 or 15 employees into companies that have 25, 30, 50, 75 employees. I think you'll see more middle-class jobs in those companies. You'll see more jobs that have benefits, and it seems like it'll be more of a pathway to the middle class. Sorry for talking so fast, and I just want to get into this great panel, but thanks for the opportunity. All right. So we've got this amazing panel. I think you all know who they are. And I want to just jump into a somewhat meaty question. One of the criticisms of the Amazon project not too long ago was that the company's arrival in Long Island City would lead to gentrification in the neighborhood and across Queens. It's not the only economic development project outside of Manhattan where concerns about gentrification have become a big deal. And I really wanted to ask all of the panel, as we look at economic development going forward in New York City, what's going on here and how do we grapple with that? How do economic development officials and policymakers grapple with this issue? Councilman, do you want to start?
Sure.
I think you have a mic already.
Oh, I have a mic already. Okay, great. And I'm loud enough to be heard. So. The central fear of our time is the fear of displacement. The fear of displacement from one's community and one's home, and that's not something that should be dismissed or taken lightly. But the right policy response to gentrification and displacement is not a moratorium on development. It should be equitable development, more affordable housing. I think, with respect to housing, something like a mandatory inclusionary housing is an example of how our city can strike a balance between growth and equity. There's going to be some measure of displacement. It's disingenuous to claim that we can prevent it entirely, but we certainly should make every effort to alleviate it.
Other folks?
I'll just jump in and say that I think that one of the things that we do very poorly in the public discussions that we have about development is to investigate what the alternative is to the things that often people are opposing. So to pick up on what the councilman was saying, if you think about development projects, it's understandable that people in neighborhoods would be concerned about new development that occurs in their immediate area. If that new development brings more people in, it's likely to increase the desirability of the neighborhood over time. If you increase the desirability of a neighborhood, prices will go up, and if prices go up, then displacement may occur. And there's lots of evidence around the city of exactly that happening in neighborhoods where development has happened. And so it's understandable, on the one hand, for people to be concerned about development, especially people who are most vulnerable to displacement. On the other hand, if because of that no development takes place in any neighborhood, then what ends up happening is you end up with displacement everywhere. Because fundamentally, the challenge that we face in the 21st century in New York is a challenge not so much of inequality, although that's something that people talk about and something that we should be concerned about, but it's a challenge of affordability. And the reason we have an issue of affordability in New York in the 21st century is because supply is not keeping pace with demand. We have grown by 1 million plus people in the last couple of decades, and we have not created enough housing to accommodate that growth. We've increased employment by 900,000 jobs in the last 10 years. We haven't created enough office space and enough industrial and warehousing space to accommodate that growth. And the impact of all of that is that costs rise for everyone. And I think that a fundamental misunderstanding that we have is that you can't be pro-affordability and anti-development. You can't be pro-affordability and anti-density, because if you want to solve those problems, as important as mandatory inclusionary housing and other affordable housing programs are, we don't have enough resources to control the entire market. The only way over the long term that we can fix this problem is by more development. If you want to see the nightmare scenario for New York, a scenario where development doesn't happen, just look across the country at the West Coast, at the Bay Area, where it's almost impossible to develop. And there you end up with a city where there's been massive displacement, there's much less diversity, and it's much more expensive than it's ever been. And so I think that looking at those alternatives are important, because if you understand that first and foremost you have to have development, then you can start asking the important questions of, okay, so if we need to have development, how do we ensure that that development occurs with as little displacement as possible, and that we account for the displacement that's occurring and help people who are displaced to make sure that they're not just pushed off the edge of the cliff and into homelessness or other problems.
So, I think, that's exactly right, what both of you are stating here. And as someone who's spent my entire career trying to, work in neighborhoods that are sort of the disadvantaged neighborhoods outside of Manhattan, it sort of is really disappointing to see something like a big economic development project that wanted to come to a neighborhood where, the city's trying desperately to attract economic development, sort of fail, because we've all sort of failed. There's blame all around. It's not, just Amazon or just the city or just the community. And I think that is really sort of how do you, these jobs are going to come to the city. As we hear now, Amazon is now looking at Manhattan because there's a building available. It's easy to put, jobs in an existing building. I think what we miss is when you get a development like this outside of Manhattan, the impact, the economic impact is much greater. There is the fear of gentrification, which we need to manage. But as the council member said, the answer is not to say no development. It really is, it's not an easy challenge. Otherwise, we would have gotten it right by now. But I think all of the things that you showed in terms of where these jobs are growing, I mean, this is an opportunity for New York City to really diversify its economic base. We've started to do that. That helped us through the last recession. And I think if we don't take really a firm hold of this and figure out a way in which we can get these jobs to come to New York and to really also prepare our own people in these neighborhoods to be able to take these jobs, we will really miss a huge opportunity. And this will be a big disservice to the communities and to the city as a whole. And we will see those repercussions not in the next 4 or 5 years, but when the next economic cycle sort of dips. So.
And I'd like to just move it out just a little bit. I agree with everything my panelists, my co-panelists have said. But one of the things that I think we have to understand is the context in which this is happening. In the United States, not just in New York City, we have lost the links between work, opportunity, and economic security. That's not just a New York thing. That's a huge change in the nature and function of what work is. And I think as we think about development, and people say gentrification, they're really pulling out one aspect of development, which is housing, which is critical. And as a council member said, somebody's going to kick you out of your house, you're going to get the kitchen knife. It's like that's your last stand, right? But it is more complex than that. And I think it behooves us to really understand the ecosystem problems that we have to knit together differently. And I think one of the challenges is that when we look at economic development, we often don't have enough ideas in the room. We don't have enough people in the room. We have, people who are doing land use, or people who are doing zoning, or people who are doing housing. But we are not really doing the kind of push to bring everyone to the table. And I think, to say something very impolitic probably, when I look out at this room, you do not look like my students. Okay? So my students, on average, so there's about 50,000 of them, they make $26,000 a year or less. They're not the same color as you. That's just what it is. There is a have and a have-not, and it's growing in the United States, and it's growing in New York. So we have to, I think, put this into a context that it's not simply about what Amazon is doing or about the as-of-right supports that business development might have, but really to understand these broken links. People work very hard in New York and don't make enough money to support themselves. I mean, it's not because they're not working. They're in the jobs that Jonathan showed us. So I think we have to really up our game in terms of understanding the interactivity of it. I mean, my fantasy is we need new algorithms. That will probably be a bad idea. But we really need to understand more what these levers are and how to knit them together.
I want to stay on this and ask all of you to just kind of go a little further and help us understand, what do economic development officials need to do differently? And one specific thing I'd like to ask on that is when we do bring economic development projects, job-intensive projects outside of Manhattan, do we need to do a better job of making sure folks in the community feel like they're going to get those jobs? Do we do enough of that right now? And is that even important?
Of course, no. I mean, even though unemployment in New York City is at historic lows, near 4%, in neighborhoods like Crotona Park East or Belmont, it's as high as 15.6%. So people are right to feel left behind by the economy. And remember, even an employment rate as high as 15.6% is only telling part of the story because it fails to capture declining participation in the labor force. And I see the crisis of chronic unemployment, especially in communities like mine in the Bronx, to be the most important issue. And it's largely neglected at the hands of the political class. Economic development without a focus on human capital, on the people we're serving, will only take you so far. New York City has historic job growth. So the problem is not a lack of job creation, it's a lack of job creation for the people who need them the most and the neighborhoods that need it the most. And we're not targeting job creation. We're not tailoring it to the communities in greatest need. And that's the problem. And people have every right to feel left behind because they have been left behind. It's objectively the case.
I also think that frequently economic development officials don't think about very important tools that government has at its disposal as economic development tools. And I'll give a few examples. I think, first of all, the most important economic development tool that we have is education. And as your presentation demonstrates, in many ways, our education system continues to fail New York's residents. You know, I have 2 kids in New York City's public schools. They go to a great public school, but the parents have to pay for half the supplies in the classroom because the school district doesn't provide them. And thankfully, in our neighborhood, we're able to afford to do that. We pay for extra teachers to provide arts education and other enrichment. The school district doesn't provide that. And in a lot of ways, those are the extras. In many schools, forget about arts education, forget about supplies. You're not even teaching kids how to read and write and add and subtract. And that's a huge problem for us because as the charts on the screen before illustrated, the growth is happening in jobs that require skills. And you know, we can all hope and wish that the past were to return and that people could get jobs that pay well without having those skills, but that's just not the economy that we have today, and there's almost nothing that government can do to change that. So the only alternative that we have is to invest in education and get education right, and there are a whole host of reasons that are probably too complicated to go into at this panel for why our school system doesn't work, but it doesn't work. And that's probably the biggest problem that we have, and that's an economic development problem. Another thing that I'll also say is I'll come back to this concept of affordability. And when people talk about affordability, the first thing that people talk about is housing, or think about is housing, and they think about how expensive housing is, which it is. But there are other affordability issues in New York. Probably the most important is just how expensive it is to do anything here. It's expensive to build in New York. It's expensive to do business in New York. And there are real-world impacts that those expenses have on our economy. Because it's so expensive to build, less gets built. Because less gets built, everything is more expensive. Because it's so expensive to do business, what do companies do? Companies are profit-oriented, and they're going to try to ship as many jobs as they can away from the high-cost location and to a low-cost location. And the jobs that they ship away are the lowest value jobs. And you know what those lowest value jobs, who those lowest value jobs employ? They employ the very people that we're talking about who have a hard time finding paths to the middle class. Why is it that banks are moving jobs to Utah? The reason they're moving jobs to Utah is because there are lots of functions that can be accomplished just as easily in Utah as they can in New York. And the jobs that are leaving here are not the high-paying, high-skilled jobs. They're the middle-class jobs. And when our government puts new regulations in place and when our government puts new expenses that increase the cost of doing business, even though it's often difficult to draw the direct link, the cumulative effect of that is that you're creating exactly this problem that we're all bemoaning and that we're saying that we want to solve, which is not, by the way, an argument for doing away with regulation by any stretch of the imagination, but we don't have smart regulation. We don't have thoughtful regulation in New York. We fix problems when they appear without thinking about what the ultimate costs of those fixes are. We put fixes on top of fixes. We often solve the same problem 2 different ways. And even though each of those maybe adds a penny to doing business here and a nickel to doing business there, when you put them all together, it makes New York too expensive. And that's a huge problem for us. So again, I would say that economic development officials should be thinking about that regulatory regime and that cost structure as an economic development tool, not just bringing Amazon to Queens, not just building new buildings and not just investing in infrastructure.
Gail, in my presentation, I talked a lot about how, you know, some of the most high-wage, potential middle-class jobs that are growing are in the tech sector. This is going to continue. This is the way the economy is going. But, you know, I look around the city and I get a sense that there's a lot of folks that feel like they have no shot at all about getting these tech jobs. I see, you know, some folks say we don't want tech because it's not for us. You know, so what do we need to be doing to make sure a much broader base of New Yorkers are able to get these jobs of the future?
Well, I think, and the council member talked about investing in human infrastructure, in the human capital that actually runs our city. And I think that we're faced with not just a short-term problem, but a massively different problem. It used to be that if we built a place for the manufacturers, there would be jobs there, excuse me, and the city would thrive. And that's mostly, if I'm reading it correctly, how our economic development dollars go. they go to bricks and mortar. They go to zoning, they go to density. Like, that's the focus and that's the energy. If we took, and I would make a radical change, if we took half the money that New York EDC, that Empire State, that all of our laws put into buildings, and we put it into people, you could absolutely create the workforce of the future. And you have to do it by changing what people like me do, college presidents, do as much as what people like Seth do, you know, the economic development people. It requires a radical change. In the early part of the 1900s, about 7% of the US population graduated from high school. In 40 years, almost 50%. And after that, what did we have? An explosion of American economic development. I think we're at one of those crisis points. I think we have to say, you know what? We've been doing sewers, we've been doing density, we've been doing zoning. That's great. Now we have to fundamentally rethink what economic development means. And I think when you look at tech, it means people. And it also means a rejiggering of what we do in higher education. So it's not like, how old are your kids, Seth?
4 and 6.
4 and 6, so they have a ways to go, right? So if you have like teenagers, right, that's great. They're gonna go to college. They're not just gonna go to college. They're not gonna go in for 4 years and come out cooked. It's an amalgam. They might come out cooked only if they're really damned lucky, and you're pretty rich, actually. So what you have to do is really break apart these systems that used to say a college degree is this, and then when you're done, you're done. It is really breaking that apart so that you're embedding in curriculum the kind of digital skills that kids need probably in high school, up to students at LaGuardia. They shouldn't get an associate's degree in civil engineering, which they can do, but there should be a tech-enabled skills development in there. There's no funding for that. You have to really rethink those things. And we need businesses not to just, you know, and I've dealt with a lot of you wonderful employers, and they can be wonderful, but there is a lot of complaining out there, like, your graduates don't do what I want them to do. It's like, okay, but you just waited at the end to say, I want to hire you. You have not invited us in, nor have we pushed our way in. I mean, I really think it's both ways, to say, so what are those skills? And what signaling does business do? So we worked terrifically, and it was a hard slog with Weill Cornell, who kept hiring people with bachelor's degrees for a not very sexy job, medical billing, and they turned over more than one a year. By really coming together with them, we said, you don't need a bachelor's degree, you need the skills. And we took people who had high school diplomas, who were mostly adults, who came in for 18 weeks. They loved these jobs. They had been cleaning houses. They had been doing terrible, you know, home health care. And they had a real job. It made $43,000 a year. They had health benefits, and they had education benefits. And now coming back and getting their associate's degree. It's breaking these things apart. But fundamentally, if we said tomorrow, let's take half the money we now use for economic development, EDC and New York State, and put it into education, you would, in 8 or 10 years, have the workforce that you needed.
Councilman, you've made a lot of attention in recent weeks, raising some, I think, really important points about the mayor's plan to create 100,000 good jobs. And I'm curious, obviously we want to see more accountability. We want to make sure that the dollars are being invested in that program actually create the jobs that are being talked about. But I'm curious, going forward, what are some of the things that you'd like to see the city do, either to create more good jobs or make sure more New Yorkers are able to access the good jobs that are being created in the city?
Well, I mean, to follow up, I think to follow up on the point that the president made, one of the criticisms of the mayor's jobs plan is a $1.3 billion plan, and almost all of it is on physical infrastructure. There's no investment in workforce development. And I feel economic development without human capital will only take you so far. It's going to perpetuate the underlying inequities in our economy. It's not going to solve them. But second, just like we prioritize physical infrastructure over human infrastructure, I feel we often prioritize higher education over vocational schooling. There's a as you pointed out, I think correctly, the skill is more important than the credential. And a phrase that I've heard is the cult of the baccalaureate. Should we re-examine this notion that everyone should go to college? There are some people who prefer and are better suited to vocational schooling, and yet there continues to be a deeply ingrained cultural bias against vocational education. I think federal policy, federal funding prioritizes higher education. And so you go through 4 years of college, you graduate with massive debt, and you might have diminished job prospects, or even community colleges often have abysmal graduation rates. I've seen graduation rates as low as 10%. So it might be worth rethinking this obsession that we have with higher education, with the cult of the baccalaureate. So I would say greater emphasis on vocational schooling, greater emphasis on human infrastructure, and break down the silos between government and business, right? P-Tech provides an interesting model that IBM partnered with DOE and CUNY to create a workforce development program. So 4 years of high school, 2 years of college, and you have a pathway to a job with IBM. That could be a model for how we do workforce development and apprenticeships elsewhere in the city.
That's a great point, and if anybody wants to jump in, go ahead.
Sorry, just one quick point. I think, though, the one point I make, which I don't think is different from what you're making, but I think is worth emphasizing, which is that in the 21st century economy, it's not a choice, it's not an either or, that we should be de-emphasizing the bachelor's degrees in higher education and emphasizing instead vocational training and the skills training that we've been talking about. We have to do both. Because to succeed in the 21st century economy, we have to figure out how to redistribute opportunity better, but we also have to make sure that we have opportunity to redistribute in the first place. And you were asking again for what economic development officials should be focusing on. The realization that I had, maybe too late, but the realization that I had during my experience at the Bloomberg administration was that for all of the big headline economic development projects that we put in place, the most important thing that we did, I think, was Mayor Bloomberg's emphasis on quality of life and making New York a magnet for the best and the brightest. And by making New York a magnet for the best and the brightest, we attracted exactly the kinds of businesses that are fueling this economic growth that we're having. Which is not, again, to say that the job is done when you've created macro level wealth and prosperity. You have to make sure that that wealth and prosperity gets distributed all across the population, which is why you need both of these investments in skills. But it can't be one or the other. We don't have the luxury of choice. And when it comes to higher education, when it comes to our public schools, all of them are starved for resources. And why are students leaving school with the debt that they're leaving? Part of the reason is because we've been defunding our public universities. And so tuitions have been forced to rise, and this once affordable avenue towards these skills that would allow you to get these middle class jobs now are much less affordable. And while to somebody who's looking at a $60,000 cost of a private university, a $10,000 or $15,000 tuition check may not seem like that much. If you're coming from a family that earns $20,000 a year or less, that's a huge expense, and you do in fact leave with that burden, and it's very hard to dig your way out from under that. So we have to make sure that we're investing on both ends of the spectrum and everywhere in between. Education is key to all of this.
Can I add something I want to pick up something that Gail was talking about, sort of fundamentally dismantling the way we've been doing the teaching and rethinking. And I think the pace of technology is so fast and so disruptive at this point that if we don't do that, your billing sort of pipeline is going to become outdated in a few years, right? The IBM technology is changing at a rate that is really hard for us to even grasp. So I'm not an educationist, but I think we really need to figure out, an educator, we need to figure out really how do we prepare the next generation to deal with this rapid change and uncertainty. And I think our schools are not doing that. Our colleges are not doing that because they are still based on the 1950s and 60s model where you built the big manufacturing facility, the jobs were there forever. I mean, and to me, it's not a question of whether you invest the dollars in the physical infrastructure of the jobs, whether it's, a new building or not. I don't think it's an, either or. I think we need both. I mean, to Seth's point, the fact that we invested in all of those things in the last 15 years is why we have companies wanting to come here. And I think we just need to figure out how to do it in a way that we can get our communities to be equal participants in that. And that has been sort of our bigger failing here.
Picking up on a couple of points, I heard you talk about career and technical education, and Gail about partnerships with employers. And in our research, I think that we've seen that whether it's the vocational schools, CTE schools, whether it's the community colleges, that we do need to make improvements in employer-informed curricula, in reaching out to employers and making sure as technology, as programs change so fast, as the employer demands and needs change so fast, there needs to be, with our education system at all levels, better relationships with employers. But I wanted to kind of say that and lead into my question, which is, what's the role of employers and companies here? And I want to also point out, look, employers have done a whole lot. They created 903,000 private sector jobs in New York City over the last decade. That's a lot. But in this economy where there is some really understandable frustration about people that are working but not getting ahead, what do employers need to be doing more or differently these days?
I think part of it is that there really and there are no incentives from government. Like, while Cornell had to put real skin in the game and they had to work with us, that's tough for an employer, especially you can think of a small business. They don't have time to spend with me. So one of the things is we have to create systems that allow for that kind of collaboration. And employers need to signal both to potential employees, but really to educational institutions, what do you need? I'll talk about, Carol Consolado is here from Con Ed, and we've started a P-Tech college on energy generation with Con Ed and electrical grid. And I was just meeting with our engineering faculty. We just graduated our first class a year and a half ago, who came up through 9th grade, went to 2 years, focused on basically electrical engineering, civil engineering. We have these students now at Con Ed. Our faculty went and said, so what do you think? Now that point of the faculty going into the business and saying, how did we do? Revolutionary. And Con Ed, to their credit, said, well, they did great on this and this. I have no idea what I'm talking about, so I can't even name the category they did well in. But they did not so good on this. And faculty said, good to know. And they came back and redid the curriculum so that students come to Con Ed not only ready to be absolutely productive, but ready to go and complete their bachelor's degree and hopefully beyond at City College and bring that knowledge with them. So employers have to be transparent about what the real skills are. What the real skills are. There's huge differences, for example, between what you see on monster.com in terms of what credential we want and what people actually have. Let's be honest about that, but there has to be this ongoing, this is what we need. And you have to understand that the folks that we're educating and training are not just the 19-year-olds. They're the 45-year-old who's been at Con Ed for 25 years, and now everything they've done is gone.
It's outdated, yeah.
And we have to really think about how to do that and say to places like LaGuardia, so step up your game, this is what we need for this incumbent worker.
Seth, I want to say, obviously, we've seen 900,000 net job growth. You had a lot to do with it. I think you did a lot of great work when you were president of EDC. And I'm just curious, we didn't talk about this beforehand, but if you were taking over as head of the city's economic development agency today, what would you do differently, or what kind of priorities? What would you like to do?
Well, I think that the challenges that we were facing in the Bloomberg administration, which seem like a long time ago and very far away, were really challenges of an existential nature, and there were real questions about whether New York would be able to continue to survive and thrive in an economy where technology was going to make location irrelevant, where you had the September 11th attacks and businesses were thinking that they shouldn't be concentrated in single locations, where you had the financial system collapse and ground zero for that was essentially New York. And so, what our focus was on, I think appropriately, was really in trying to get the machine working again and make sure that we were in a position to compete in a very competitive 21st century globalized economy. I think that what we're now dealing with is the negative impacts of what generally has been a positive story, which is that growth has not only occurred, but it's occurred at a pace that's faster than anyone ever anticipated or dreamed of. And we're now dealing with the negative side effects of too much growth. And the answer to that can't be less growth, because that ultimately, as difficult as the problems of growth are to deal with, the problems of decline are much more difficult to deal with. But I think where we really need to focus now is on ensuring that the growth is benefiting more New Yorkers. And what we're clearly seeing from all of the statistics that you cited, what the political system is clearly giving us in terms of feedback, is that too many New Yorkers feel like they're not benefiting. And so if I were in that position today, I think that would really be my focus. And to the councilman's point about the mayor's jobs plan, which I applaud him for, I think that there's one piece that's missing from that, which is critical, which is that the mayor's job plan is focused on creating 100,000 good-paying jobs, which are defined as jobs that earn more than $50,000 a year. That's great. We need more of those jobs. But that's not really our problem. We're creating lots of good-paying jobs. The problem is that those good-paying jobs aren't going to large segments of our population, and we need to figure out how to create those kinds of jobs for a different type of person. And I think everything that we've been talking about in terms of investment in human capital is where economic development policy should be focusing. And again, I don't want to lose this, because I think this is also important. We have to figure out how to make the city cheaper. We have to figure out how to make it less expensive to do business here, because that's another piece of this puzzle that can't get ignored. And it's so easy for us to put additional burdens on businesses and just assume that there are no consequences. But there are consequences. There are real consequences. And this is as much a discussion about that as it is an investment in human capital and making sure that we have the skills for people to take the jobs that happen to be coming here.
Thank you, Seth, and thanks to all these amazing panelists. Please join me in congratulating, thanking them. I wish we had more time, but that's all, folks. Thank you, ma'am.